Welcome back to the Nick Bartlett Show, everybody. And so, in today's edition, we're going to start off kind of a little summer series here. I'm going to be interviewing different writers from different schools in regards to the Pac-12's kind of like non-conference matchups, that sort of thing. So today we're going to start off with Utah, Florida, and I'm going to be joined by Graham Hall. He's a staff writer at 247 Sports. With specifically the Florida writer. And so, yeah, just we're going to do a little preview of the game here today. And before we get into it, do you want to say a quick hi or anything you want to add there, Graham?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to talk all things Florida. I grew up in Gainesville, Florida down here, and I went to UF, and now I have an objective view covering the team. I'm 9 years into the business now out of college, and it's a pleasure to work for 247 Sports. I work with some of the best in the business, and I'm looking forward to getting out there to Salt Lake City this year to the West Coast a little bit and see this Florida-Utah matchup, which is going to be a very intriguing one, I think, for the Florida Gators, because not many people, I think, know what to expect from this team coming off a 6-7 finish, losing the number 4 overall pick in the draft and Anthony Richardson, several pieces from last season's defense, a largely rebuilt roster that hinges on transfers and freshmen, and obviously potentially a new quarterback in Graham Mertz. So it's an exciting time to cover the team, and it's my pleasure to talk about it with you.
Definitely. Yeah, no, it's definitely a lot of turnover. Obviously, losing Anthony Richardson just kind of think us Pac-12 fans may have a little bit of a feeling because of the game last year, but, just a phenomenal talent in his own right, even if there may have been a bit of consistency issues. But obviously, getting picked in the NFL speaks for itself. But so before we get into the actual game here, my kind of question is, Florida's historically been kind of a powerhouse. I mean, again, Utah's, two-time defending Pac-12 champs and, went down and lost last year. What's kind of the general feel of the program coming off 2 consecutive losing seasons, which feels a bit unordinary for Florida?
I think it's pretty tough for a lot of fans to deal with right now. There is some faith in Billy Napier, especially if you're someone who a lot of people in our community especially are very in tune with how teams are doing from a recruiting perspective. And if you're following how Florida is doing right now on the recruiting trail, I think that you can be very optimistic about what Billy Napier is building in Gainesville, right? But coming off a 6-7 finish, a team that, it was only a couple of years ago, Nick, that the Gators were in the conversation for a New Year's Six Bowl and headed to the SEC championship game. And that, the second to last year of the Dan Mullen era there in 2020, they had a great offense with Kyle Trask. And now this is a program rebuilding. And in that time, you have seen not only Georgia win now consecutive national championships, but Tennessee has become a very good program. Josh Heupel, I think, in second year there, exceeded expectations, and now they have a very promising program, and we'll have to see what Joe Milton does this season, whether he's able to live up to what Hendon Hooker was able to do last year. But you look around the SEC, you look even at South Carolina. I know Florida beat that team 38-6 last year, but that's a South Carolina team that has been in contention, and many people now heading into SEC Media Days are projecting South Carolina to finish above the Gators in the SEC. Kentucky right there as well. Mark Stoops, I think, maybe flying under the radar a little bit with how long he's been in the SEC and how good of a program he's built in Lexington. Florida fans are certainly aware that team beat Florida last year in Gainesville 26-16. So Florida finds themselves in the bottom half, so to speak, of the SEC East. And that is a difficult pill to swallow, because you're talking about a program that less than 2 decades ago won 2 championships in the BCS era in the span of 3 years and had players like, Tim Tebow and Percy Harvin. And before the regular season starts, we're going to see this documentary about this great time at Florida, which is going to make fans obviously nostalgic for tuning into Netflix, but they're also going to maybe be a little bit, mixed emotions there with seeing where Florida stands right now going into the season. You're not going to see, I think, necessarily prolific quarterback play, because this is going to be a run dominant team. And there's, I think, a lot of unknowns still, from the quarterback battle to some of the health of the offensive linemen, who is going to be the leading wide receivers for this team. It's certainly a lot of unknowns right now for a historically successful program that's right now in the rebuilding phase, even though they're coming off of a win last season over Utah. Billy Napier was the first Florida coach to win against a top 10 team at home in their debut as a head coach. I know that seems like an obscure stat, but that's a really impressive mark to have on your resume, to go beat a Utah program that, like you mentioned, coming off of consecutive Pac-12 championships. So I think for Florida, if they can avoid the inconsistency of last year, if the defense can improve, if they can be a run-oriented team, this could be a team that surprises a lot of people, starting with Utah out there in Salt Lake City.
Definitely, yeah. And I feel Florida kind of is like a bit comparable to how Oregon. Obviously, Florida is a much more historical kind of lineage in college football, but I feel just didn't Florida lose to Kentucky and Tennessee last year? And I believe Oregon lost to like Oregon State and Washington. So for programs like that, and particularly in SEC territory, it feels like you probably just want a little bit more. But yeah, let's see what I got here on the first question. So yeah, took care of that. Yeah, you kind of touched on it a bit here. Just how do you feel about Graham Mertz, or I'm blanking on the other guy who could be stepping in here, the sophomore, but
Jack Miller the third, yeah, the former Ohio State quarterback. Really interesting, I think, battle here, so to speak, because you bring in a guy like Graham Mertz, who played 4 years at Wisconsin and had appeared in 32 games, and a former Elite 11 guy that had a lot of hype and maybe didn't live up to all the hype. But if you go back and watch a lot of his film, a lot of really desirable stuff. He can make the downfield throw. He can escape the pocket. He senses pressure well. He's smart. He understands. He lets the play develop. He understands where his receivers are. He has good chemistry, and he's a great presence to have in the locker room. Is he going to be one of the SEC's elite quarterbacks? I don't know about that. I think that Florida's offense, like I just said, is not really conducive to having a guy like Graham Mertz go out and throw for 3,000 yards. I think it's realistic that you could see him have a 2,000 plus yard season, but this isn't a guy who's going to put up Kyle Trask type numbers. Florida is going to run the football more often than not. This is an offense that's going to run through Montrell Johnson and Trevor Etienne. Yeah, they're going to throw the ball 20 times a game, but this is not going to be an offense that wants to go out and win games by establishing the vertical passing game. I think that is not what Billy Napier, that is not his MO on offense. You go back to his time at Louisiana, even when he was at Alabama as a wide receivers coach, I think that he was understanding that his teams were going to establish the downfield passing game through running the football. And that's what you look at the advanced analytics on Graham Mertz to answer your question. That is what he does well. I think that a lot of people look so much at the face value statistics, the interception, what he was asked to do at Wisconsin. I mean, that was an offense that the last couple of years, there were a lot of other problems that were not related to Graham Mertz. You get him in an ideal situation. You set him up as a quarterback. You let the run establish what he can do, and you let him be a weapon in his own right without asking him to do too much. I think he can be a successful quarterback in the SEC. Again, is he going to have the numbers of some of these guys like Devin Leary? I don't know. I don't think so. Absolutely. But do I think he's going to be a hindrance to Florida's offense this season? I do not. The interesting thing is that we just talked all about Graham Mertz. I just rambled all about him, and he hasn't even been named the starting quarterback, right? Jack Miller started in the bowl game last season against Oregon State. Florida loses that game in pretty embarrassing fashion, right? They had to kick a field goal in the final couple minutes to avoid being shut out for the first time in, I don't even know, 400-something games. It was one of the longest streaks in the nation without being shut out. Florida kicks a field goal, but Jack Miller, leading that offense, wasn't able to get the Gators a touchdown against a very, very good, as you know, Oregon State team that is even potentially going to be better this season. So maybe people are looking, again, face value at what Jack Miller did last season, but he's been in the offense longer than Graham Mertz. He's fully healthy now. Last season, that was an issue when he suffered that thumb avulsion fracture in preseason camp that kept him out for 3 months. And he really had trouble, even when he was healthy, gripping a football until the final couple of weeks there. So wasn't even healthy for a full month before that Oregon State game. He's a much better quarterback than what he showed in that game. And that's a reason why Graham Mertz has not been named the starter just yet. Aside from those two guys, if an injury were to hit like it did last season with Jack Miller, Florida's quarterback situation is very, very dicey. I mean, you look at what Florida failed to do in the past 6 months. It was add a freshman quarterback that potentially could get reps if they need him to come into the game. Jaden Rashada ends up not enrolling at Florida, as everyone knows, high profile situation. He ends up there in the Pac-12 at Arizona State. And then this past couple of months, Florida thought that they were going to get their quarterback commit, Austin Simmons, to reclassify from the 2025 class to the 2023 class and get to Gainesville in time for fall camp to potentially start getting some reps, at least get to practice. He ends up flipping to Ole Miss and reclassifying with Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin. So Florida, outside of Graham Mertz and Jack Miller, after him, it's Max Brown, who has not been able to get in a game yet. So kind of an interesting situation at quarterback where Florida feels good about their two options, but after them, that would absolutely be a difficult pill to swallow if Florida had to turn to someone outside of Graham Mertz or Jack Miller.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying, Graham Mertz can manage a game pretty well, and I feel a lot of people there's no other way to say it. They take that as a slight a little bit, and I feel like some of the best quarterbacks of all time, for example, Tom Brady was an amazing game manager. I'm out here in Seattle. Russell Wilson pre-Bronco days was a great game manager. So, like you're saying, Florida's got a lot of skill players around there that can kind of do some things. We haven't touched on a guy I really like in Ricky Pearsall yet, but like, if he can just kind of, like you're saying, maybe just run the offense a little bit, hold down the fort, get the ball to the players a little bit, the skill position players, maybe they could do some things. So let's see what we got here next. The next question, and this was kind of my biggest one. A lot of people feel that the Florida offensive line actually may have gotten a bit better, which is possible, but do you feel that's accurate considering they lost 4 starting linemen? Including a very elite player?
It's possible. I think that let's talk about that elite player, losing O'Cyrus Torrence. There's not a guy on the roster that's going to be able to do what he did last season. I mean, no penalties, didn't allow a sack, impeccable leader in the locker room, knew the expectations, knew the coaching staff. That's a guy, big shoes to fill. I hate to use the cliche. Florida thought that they were going to have a seamless transition, so to speak, when they went out and got Micah Mazuka from Baylor. That guy played a couple practices in spring practice, and then he ended up getting shoulder surgery to end camp for him, and kind of an unknown situation indicated maybe that he would explore even transferring once again from Florida, but is expected to be healthy in time for fall camp and should start at left guard if all goes according to plan for Florida. Right guard is going to be filled. That former spot by Torrance can be filled by Richie Leonard. I think the improvement, and this is not to slight anyone from the previous team, is that Austin Barber is going to now have that full-fledged starting role. Austin Barber, I think, is a name that people should know. He's one of the best linemen in the SEC and, in my opinion, in the nation. Just a third-year guy coming in and now going to play left tackle, protect the blind side of whichever quarterback ends up starting for the Gators. He played in that right tackle rotation last season. Michael Tarquin got injured early in the year and came back, but that ankle injury was still bothering Tarquin throughout the year, and that allowed Barber to play a little bit more throughout the season than he normally would have. And now it's all his role. That is the guy who's going to be an improvement at left tackle over Richard Garage, even though Garage was very, very good, a veteran leader for the Gators. That big question, like I said, is at left guard, because if Micah Mazuka is not able to go this season, you're looking at starting potentially, actually very likely, a true freshman in Najee Harris out of IMG Academy. I mean, you're talking about starting a true freshman in the SEC week 1 at Utah. That is a daunting task for that guy, even, coming from a place like IMG Academy. So you're hoping that Mazuka, the junior, is going to be ready to play come week 1, because if he is, and then you get Kingsley Eguakon back, Richie Leonard, and then that competition at right tackle between Keontae Goodwin, a former 5-star prospect by 247 Sports, competing with Damian George, a transfer from Alabama, along the offensive line. So Florida likes their competition at right tackle. Potentially that unit could be improved this season, but heading into fall camp, still some question marks, I think, that we got to see answered before we can say one way or the other whether that unit's going to take a step forward or a step back potentially this season.
No doubt. Yeah, no, I hear that feels a little bit more to me, it feels a little bit maybe more level-headed than some of the kind of other reports I've been reading out here. But yeah, I'd kind of wait and see as with a lot of teams in this new era of college football. But so I think this is maybe a little bit kind of funner question. You got Montrell Johnson Jr. or Trevor Etienne out of the backfield. And might as well, since I got kind of two questions combined here, we also got Ricky Pearsall at wide receiver. Out of that trio, or maybe there's another wideout or even a tight end that I'm missing, is there like a skill position player that I need to know on offense, or is it one of those three guys?
I mean, those three are absolutely the three to know. I can give you a couple more names. Absolutely. Obviously Trevor Etienne, like you mentioned, and, Montrell Johnson are going to be the leaders of that backfield, and Ricky Pearsall is going to be Florida's number one wide receiver. But after those guys, they're going to have to spread the ball around. And then you're talking about a freshman potentially in either Andy Jean out of Miami, who was very impressive. Florida is really, really high on him. And then Aiden Mizell, another freshman. His parents both ran track at the University of Florida in the 90s. And in spring camp, his first organized practice sessions in college, he was already the fastest player on that UF roster. And you go back to that spring game in April, he was getting behind the Florida secondary multiple times. So you talk about a guy that could make an impact as a freshman. Andy Jean, Aiden Mizell, both right there. Eugene Wilson right there as well. But I got to throw one more at you that may be a potential curveball. It's been a long time, and by a long time, I mean by the football carousel cycle here. We're talking, 2-3 seasons where Florida has had production really in the passing game from the tight end position. You go back to Kyle Pitts, that's the guy. That's a high bar, right? Where everyone is looking for that next Kyle Pitts, so to speak. Does Florida have one on their roster? I don't know if they have one as dominant as Kyle Pitts, but they are really, really optimistic that redshirt freshman Arlis Boardingham, a guy from your side out there from Van Nuys, California, who made the trip over to Gainesville, initially wore number 81, had a great spring. I think he's going to end up starting at tight end for Florida this season. He's got a great frame. He's got great speed. And I think he's going to play a good bit this season. He gets open in the passing game. He's got good size. And going back to what Billy Napier likes to do, a lot of 12-man personnel, right, with two tight ends on the field with a running back. You like to have a tight end who can block and a guy who can get open, two guys who need to be able to do both. They have one who can block in Dante Sanders, but they need one who can get open in the passing game, and that is Arlis Boardingham this season. I think that he ends up being a surprise for this team this season and ends up producing a good bit.
Awesome. You said Arlis Boardingham?
Yeah, great name, right? Arlis, A-R-L-I-S, Boardingham. It's a fantastic name. Kind of makes me think of one of those guys outside guarding the castle for the Queen. I think it's a fantastic name. Florida's hoping that he protects their passing game a little bit this season and protects their quarterback as a blocker as well, because great strength, great frame, great width, and great speed. This guy, if it's not this season, it's going to be next season. He's got a lot of potential, and Florida's hoping that he does a little bit this season.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I'm thinking that could be a really nice match with Mertz too, a guy who maybe kind of understands the system a little bit better. Tight ends are usually really beneficial for quarterbacks like that. And when you said the name Arlis Boardingham, if I'm still getting that right,
yeah,
I think I know it's a new day and age. It took everything within my control to not like do some sort of accent. I'm gonna move on to the next question. So I'm trying to be mature here.
That's good. Self-control.
Yeah. And then the next question, now, defense has been kind of a little bit rougher, so we're not going to kind of discuss that too deeply. But my main question for you is just how do you feel about the new defensive coordinator, Austin Armstrong? And since we're both a little bit younger guys here, do you feel like maybe he could benefit from a bit more experience? I know that was kind of a knock on the previous coordinator, or do you feel like he's the right man for the job regardless of age?
I do think he's the right man for the job. Sometimes you're just ready no matter what your age is. And this is a guy that, go back to even January. Last year, he was at Southern Mississippi, ends up getting hired by Nick Saban, right? Best in the business in January to be his linebackers coach. And, if Nick Saban hadn't hired him, he was going to get a call from Dan Lanning out there at Oregon or Georgia was going to bring him back. That's what was going to happen here. And so that's why you saw that report about Patrick Toney moving on from Florida. In that same report, I believe it was Chris Lowe who put it out from ESPN. He had Austin Armstrong's name in there right away. Patrick Toney and Austin Armstrong have a relationship. I think that helped here. There's a little bit of a mentor-mentee relationship between Armstrong and Toney. Armstrong has learned a lot of what Toney has done, and then he's kind of taken his own spin on it a little bit when he was out there with the Golden Eagles and learning even a little bit at Alabama here. A guy who's just going on 30 years old. I'm only 30. I know you're a young guy as well. That makes me feel really old seeing a guy like that already be a Power 5 coordinator making $1 million. But Austin Armstrong is a guy who knows what he's doing. He's a student of the game. He's enthusiastic. He's aggressive, but he's safe. I think you're going to see Florida be a little bit, I hate to use a cliche, but multidimensional sounds like a cliche, but that's really kind of what it's going to be. You're going to see packages where guys can line up on the outside and then move to inside linebacker. You're going to see a variety of 5 defensive back formations. You're going to see some 4-2-5. I think this is going to be a system that is going to allow a lot of guys to thrive on the outside, and it's going to rely on the depth that Florida added on the interior of the defensive line, going back and getting Cameron Jackson in the transfer portal at the beginning when that window opened, adding Caleb Banks. You get Chris McClellan back, Desmond Watson, the absolute unit there on the inside, and then you add, Princely Umanmielen there on the outside there. And, I think cornerback is a strength of this team. Absolutely. You look at strengths on the roster of this team, cornerback has to be up there in my mind. You get Jason Marshall Jr. back, who last season as a sophomore had a really, really good season. He was, I think, top 10 in coverage in terms of returning guys by Pro Football Focus. He's someone who's physical. I think that, his passer rating against was just extremely impressive. Guys might as well have been throwing it in the dirt. I'd like to see a little bit more from him this season, but he is Florida's #1 cornerback. And then after him, you look at Devin Moore, who Florida's coaching staff is extremely, extremely high on. He should be the #2 starting cornerback for this team this season after missing the end of last season with a shoulder injury. After him, you have Jalen Kimber, who's still competing for that spot. He transferred from Georgia and has dealt with a variety of injuries. Otherwise, I think he could have potentially locked down a starting spot earlier. And then Florida added Jakeem Jackson, a very promising freshman. They have a bunch of other abundance of promising defensive backs as well that they added in the last year. And then safety has been overhauled after losing their starters. So this is a defense that should take a step forward is what I'm saying. They have added depth at every single position. And this is starting to get to the point for Billy Napier where he has overhauled enough of the roster where it is more so of his guys right now. And he no longer has the excuse, so to speak, that he doesn't have the pieces or the personnel or the depth because he has gone out there in the portal or on the recruiting trail and identified each piece that he wants in his defense. And I think that this coordinator in Austin Armstrong is going to lead to an improvement in a lot of categories for Florida this season after really the defense has been woeful since 2016, right? 2017. It's pre-pandemic, and that's when I get my years a little bit mixed up. So I know that Florida fans are certainly hoping that this new hire in Austin Armstrong, along with the new additions in the fold, are going to lead to some improvement in Gainesville this season on the defensive end.
Definitely. Is there there are a couple names you already touched on the secondary a bit here. I think Jason Marshall is probably kind of the biggest name. Princely, how do you say that? I don't want to disrespect the last name. How do you say that last name?
Umanmielen.
Those are 2 big names. And then you got Shamar James, a linebacker, who I think it was something like in tackles in the mid-40s last year. And then you have Taraja Mitchell, who's a nice little transfer. And anyone kind of out of that group, or am I leaving someone out? Any other names that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, Shamar James is a guy that, could have gone to Alabama. He would be playing at Alabama right now. He could have gone anywhere in the SEC, and he is going to absolutely play at probably that will linebacker spot for Florida this season. I know that the belief is that it maybe is a little bit easier for guys to get on the field at will linebacker, that weak side spot, rather than playing at the Mike position. I think that for James, he could play either spot for Florida. Getting Taraja Mitchell was huge. A guy in his 6th year who played for a championship team, was a former captain at Ohio State, a good locker room presence, dealt with some bad injuries, and just the overall talent that the Buckeyes had led to him losing some playing time the last couple of years, and now he's at Florida competing for that spot. So I think that linebacker unit, after you lose Ventrell Miller and Amari Burney from last year's team, 2 guys who end up going in the NFL draft to the Jaguars and the Bills, respectively, you end up going out and getting Taraja Mitchell. You get Shamar James back. But the big one, I think that maybe many people are missing is Manny Nunnery, because that guy, a 5th-year guy, Ronald Nunnery is his former name, now goes by Manny Nunnery. He transferred to Florida from Houston. He was initially recruited as a safety, as an outside linebacker in some schemes. He's going to play a weak side linebacker spot for Florida this season. I think that he will play in that rotation with Shamar James. But maybe the reason why I am very high on Manny Nunnery, maybe more so than a lot of other people, is that guy makes plays on special teams. When you think about those good teams at Florida, those incredible championship winning teams in the 2000s, even going back to the 90s before my time, man, I mean, you had to have effective special teams play to turn the tide. I mean, that's just the case in today's day and age. There's a reason why games and plays like kick six and punt blocks, field goal blocks are so impactful. Manny Nunnery in his 2021 season at Houston blocked 5 kicks. He blocked 3 field goal attempts and a pair of punt blocks. If you can have that game-changing presence on special teams and a guy who can rotate in at that weak side linebacker, that will linebacker spot, and be able to provide some depth, that is a big addition in my mind. And I know that so many people are focusing on Mitchell and getting James back, but I think that Nunnery is absolutely going to play a role for this team this season. He's experienced. He's a veteran, 5th-year guy, like I mentioned, and impactful on special teams. And you need guys like that who are able to go out there, put their body on the line, and make a game-changing play for your team.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, because we grow up in the same generation, it's down kind of in your neck of the woods. I mean, we're all America. They try and probably divide us a little bit, but we're all, it's all America. But like, you think back to our day and age, it's like Beamer ball was a huge thing down at Virginia Tech. And even as a kid, it's like, I don't even particularly remember Virginia Tech. Obviously, was it like Michael Vick for a little bit, but I don't on a kind of general basis, I don't remember them being like absolutely dominant on offense or anything, but I always remember a block kick here or there, a block punt, and that's always what felt like kind of spurred their 1 or big 2 plays in this season. So yeah, I hear you. Special teams always going to prove vital in football. I think it's often overlooked a little bit because you got just the big flashy guys. So it makes sense. So I think we pretty much touched on everything here in regards to Florida. Kind of just to make sure we're on the same page. Sounds like we're thinking we don't know who the quarterback's going to be. Sounds like the offensive line could be a bit better, and they have 3 really good weapons on offense. On defense, seems like the secondary is the strong point, and then maybe a bit of transfers here in the linebacking core and a kind of stronger unit up front. Correct me if there's anything I kind of misinterpreted there.
No, you pretty much nailed it. I do think Florida's front 7 is going to be just as good, if not better, potentially, than the secondary this season. I know Corey Raymond, maybe one that flew under the radar is that Corey Raymond, the legendary, highly regarded defensive backs coach who was at LSU for so long, he's now coaching Florida's entire secondary, the cornerbacks, safety, star position. So I think you get that unit all on one page. It should lead to, I think, less mistakes, less blown coverages in the secondary, more guys knowing their assignment. And certainly that was something that hurt Florida last season, the amount of big plays that they gave up. And then you go back to the spring game, the amount of times that Florida's defense was able to get to the quarterback. I know it's a spring game and you can't put too much stock in these, statistics like sacks when they're just touching the guy, but Florida's quarterbacks consistently faced pressure all night long from a 3- and 4-man rush. And we just talked about how good Florida's offensive line should be this season. I think that speaks highly of Florida's defensive line and what they can do this season. So I just wanted to note there that I don't think that the defensive line is going to be in any way a drop-off this season. I actually think it'll be one of the more improved units for the Gators this year, which makes me really, really it's tough for me to call this Florida Utah game, right? Because with as many questions we just talked about when it comes to Florida's roster, you have a big one, obviously, with Utah, with Cam Rising and a few other questions there. So as much as Florida has to worry about, what's on their side of the fence, as you look at Utah there, that they certainly have some things to figure out as well. And if everything goes right for this Florida team and everything I just talked about, the steps forward that they project to take, they end up taking, this could be a really, really interesting game out there in Salt Lake City.
Agreed. And I think too, I know like Pac-12, obviously we're majority of a Pac-12 site. We do other West Coast teams, but in NBA and all that, blah blah. But like I think that it may be being on the West Coast, I think people may overvalue the level of football we have in the Pac-12. I got nothing but love. I went to WSU. But like I think that anytime you have an SEC team, particularly a storied franchise like Florida, even if they're coming off, two losing seasons in a row, the talent level, the talent disparities, it's not that different. Utah's not like USC or UCLA where they're going to be recruiting all the 5-star guys. As you mentioned, Cam Rising injury, how's that going to kind of play into the game if he's not there? It's hard for me to see Utah beating Florida, to be quite frank. I'm a huge Rising fan. And as well as that, on the defensive side of the ball, Utah lost Clark Phillips III. He's the only guy I could have seen who would have been able to guard Pearsall. So I don't know how they're going to replace that. I think Utah does feel that they have a couple players, but it's really no names. And Clark Phillips was an elite player. So I'm kind of interested. I shouldn't call them no names. They're just unproven players. But so I'm interested to see. But do you have kind of a prediction, a score, or is it a little too early for you on that?
It's a close game right now in my mind. You go back to that last year's result. What was it, 29-26? I'm feeling something pretty similar. I'm feeling like a 24-21 game. I do think that Florida ends up running the ball effectively. I think they run the football for more than 200 yards. One thing I don't think we touched on too much that may play into Florida's favor a little bit is that rule change that the clock's not going to stop outside of the final 2 minutes of the first half, right? You talk about a running football team that can eat up huge chunks of yardage. If the Gators get a lead and they want to avoid mistakes, they're going to use that to their advantage and try and dominate the time of possession here and keep Utah's offense off the field here. I'm end up seeing a low scoring game right now. And right now I'm got it 24-21 Florida, but I've been wavering back and forth. I got to be completely honest. I've had 17-14 Utah in my mind for a long time. If you had asked me a couple of weeks ago, I probably would have told you I see Utah winning the game 20-17. It's that close in my mind. So to answer your question, maybe a little bit too early for me to put a prediction in ink right now, but I still think it's a one-score, 3-point game potentially there in the fourth quarter that could go either way for either team. And that's what makes it so fun, so tough to call right now.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like we're along the same lines. If I had to pick something right now, I'd say like 27-24 Utah, but that's assuming that Rising is there and healthy. So again, that's why it's kind of flip-flop. I'd probably flip-flop the score the other way if he's not playing. One player I got to mention because it'd be disrespectful to Utah to not. Brant Kuithe is back this year. You guys got to see him in full force last year, but he got injured, he missed the entire season, really. So he'll be back. I believe it's his 6th year, and he is an absolute force at tight end, a future NFL prospect. So I want to see his impact as well. So yeah, let's see. I think the final question is always usually the same thing. Got any other kind of thoughts you want to add on this matchup, Florida football, or really, got a lot going on in the college football landscape. Anything you just want to add in general?
I mean, maybe the altitude, right? You always make such a big deal out of going out there and playing. This is a Florida team that plays at sea level, right? Out there in the swamp. They're used to the humidity. Now they got to go out there and play in a little bit of altitude in Salt Lake City. Is that going to be a factor? I don't know, man. I keep thinking about it a little bit. I joked with Billy Napier a couple months ago. We were at a pre-media function, and I'm sitting there talking to Billy Napier, and I say, hey, you got a hyperbaric chamber in this new facility? And he said, yeah, we got a couple. I haven't personally used them, but players have used them. Maybe that's going to help Florida's preparation a little bit, because you always know that's a little bit of a factor. You go out there and play a 4-hour football game up there in that altitude. If you're not prepared, especially first game of the season where conditioning can be a factor. Guys are still getting into shape. I'm interested to see how that fares. It could be an interesting situation for a Florida team. Everyone always makes so much out of, well, how are they going to deal with the heat? How are they going to deal with humidity in Gainesville? I got to throw that reverse question out there into the universe and say, how is Florida going to deal with the altitude in my mind? Is it going to be no problem? If so, I'll stop asking about it in future years. But right now, I'm a little bit curious because I haven't had a chance to cover a game in Utah. I know we went out to Las Vegas just a couple of months ago, it feels like, for that Las Vegas Bowl in mid-December, but that's not the same as going up there to Salt Lake City. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, definitely very different atmosphere. Just the altitude, the fans. Florida will be ready. You guys see all these types of atmospheres in the SEC, but Utah is definitely probably one of the best in the Pac-12. All right, and now just the final question, because it's apparently they for some reason gave me a show. As a kid, did you watch WWE? Feel free to say no, and if you did, who was your favorite wrestler?
Oof, I did not. But all my friends were, of course, fans of Stone Cold Steve Austin. They all had the dolls too, man. I hate to even call them dolls, action figures, man. They all had those. I was a fan of playing with those as a kid, but I didn't ever watch. I think my parents probably thought it'd be a little too violent. But the funny thing is they let me watch as much football as I wanted. So, I think that it's a great thing to see. I still watch clips when I see them online. I can't help but laugh a little bit and sometimes be a little bit enthralled. It's kind of a cool break from, reality in a sense, kind of suspension of disbelief. So, I'm all for it, but I didn't personally grow up a fan. No.
Fair enough. You're probably see it like my voice cracked a little bit. Probably hurt the feelings. You're probably a bit cooler than me then, because I'm still I still watch it from time to time. I'm an adult, so I'm like a month and a half behind, But like so in all seriousness, thank you for your time. This has been the Nick Bartlett Show. We had Graham Hall on today, and should be a really, really fun game between Utah and Florida. Still a little bit early for both of us to kind of give a final solid prediction considering all the injuries. But very good game. Thank you guys for tuning in, and deuces.